Emerson.
Lovely. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining and welcome to today's webinar on the smallholders interpretation of the ProTerra standard. My name is Amish Bose, and in the next hour or so, we will be talking about ProTerra standard in general and then move to the requirements of the smallholder interpretation, which was published last year. This webinar was organized together with DC Korea. Before we start, I would like to inform you about the logistics of the webinar. You have been put on mute so that we can avoid any background noises during the presentation. The webinar will be recorded and this will be shared after today's webinar. And please do not hesitate to share your questions and ideas. You can do that during the webinar using the chat function. And we will answer your questions at the end. So we have reserved a time slot for questions and answers. So let's get started. Before we jump into the content, let me introduce myself briefly and the ProTerra Foundation. My name is Amish Bose. I am the director of the ProTerra Foundation. I have a scientific and economic background, and in the last 15 years, I have been working in raw material trade and developing feed safety, CSR and sustainability concepts and strategies for international companies. I lived in 7 different countries. The ProTerra Foundation is located in the Netherlands. Its mission is to be a global network of businesses supporting more sustainable agricultural practices in the food and feed supply chains, and where relevant, the conversion to non-GMOs and full respect of workers and communities' dignity. We envisage a world where all businesses contribute to the protection of biodiversity by switching to sustainable production, conserve natural resources, and ensure that local communities are treated with dignity and respect. The ProTerra Foundation is an organization that promotes sustainability at all levels of the feed and food production system. We own and continuously develop the ProTerra standard, which is a global multi-crop sustainability non-GMO standard that covers all crucial areas of responsible supply chains. That means covers all the economic, ecological, and social aspects of sustainability. The daily business of the ProTerra Foundation is managed by a secretariat, and they are directly supervised by the board of directors. Besides, the ProTerra Foundation has set up the Stakeholder Council as its advisory board. The Stakeholders Council is the governance body with strategic advisory role. It provides both the board of directors and the secretariat with recommendations and expert advice on specific topics that help companies to embed their sustainability strategies and give consumers assurance of their work done through the implementation of the standard in the food and feed supply chain. Another vital element to ensure the robustness of the ProTerra certification program is the Certification and Standards Committee. Here you can see it with a light purple, dark rose color, which is responsible, among others, for the periodical revision and updating of the ProTerra standard, the monitoring of certification bodies, the proper implementation of the ProTerra certification scheme, and the correct handling of compliance related to the implementation of the ProTerra certification scheme. Let me present you some figures very quickly. This slide shows the countries we're active in. With light blue color, you can see that where we have either production or market, so that means certified companies and members. The main countries of destination for certified products are actually still in Europe, focusing on countries such as Norway, Germany, France, or Switzerland. In this presentation, we will be focusing on soy, which is the biggest market for ProTerra, besides the increasing amount of sugar cane globally. The volumes of ProTerra certified soy are around 3 to 3.5 million tons. This slide, you can see the figures of the last 2 years and the countries of production. As I mentioned, an increasing area is, however, sugarcane, especially in South America. This slide shows you the volumes that have been and the countries where we have either done gap audits or certification. Another speaker and co-organizer for this webinar will be Alice. So delighted to welcome her here today. And I would love to ask her to continue with the presentation and briefly introduce herself. Alice is a member of the Certification and Standards Committee of the ProTerra Foundation. And yeah, thank you for being here. Alice, the word is yours.
Thank you very much, Emish. Good morning, good afternoon to all that are participating today. In the next few slides, I will try to give a brief overview of key aspects of ProTerra 4.1, that's the current and valid version of ProTerra standard. And the objective is so that we can better understand the connections and the logic behind the development of the India interpretation. The two standards are connected, and it would be impossible to speak about the ProTerra India interpretation without making reference to important aspects of ProTerra standards 4.1. The next slide, please.
Can you briefly introduce yourself, Alicia? Just a few words.
Yes.
Well, thank you.
I'm sorry. I am a civil engineer. I have a background in environmental sanitation, and I've been working with ProTerra Foundation already for approximately 10 years. Okay?
Great.
And so now we're going to be talking about supply chain risk. Emish, we were going to make a brief presentation of ProTerra Standard 4.1.
Exactly. So I'm going to talk about now briefly about why certification is needed. Thank you very much for your introduction. And then give the word back to you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So before we go into the technicalities, which is Alice's specialty, we would like to introduce you to the topic briefly. So why is certification needed? Companies do face an increasing number of risks they have to deal with in their supply chain. Just to mention some examples, these can be land grabbing, social inequities, pesticide usage, land conversion, including deforestation, which is a very hot topic nowadays, connected also to the climate change. Soy is a hidden product, and unfortunately often connected to these issues I have just mentioned. Certification is a part of the solution. Voluntary private initiatives are crucial, and governmental regulations are also needed to support us in our daily work. We will continue our mission because there is a lot to be done, and only 3% of the global soy production today is deforestation-free certified, and only 6% has some kind of certification. Land areas converted after 2008, be it for human intervention or natural causes, are not eligible for ProTerra certification. Today, through georeferencing, satellite imagery, and public information, we can ensure that the products we purchase are coming from areas that have not been cleared. Where is actually soy? Well, we can put it this way, it's almost everywhere. We can find it in our meat, dairy products, egg, fish, many products where customers don't even think that soy can be present. There is a lot going on also in Europe on legislation level. That doesn't make it more simple because the labeling and regulations may differ in each country. For example, so on the non-GM regulation, we have national regulations and laws and no complete EU regulation. That makes it also more complex for companies that are actually operating on a global scale, because they have to be aware of every national legislation they operate in. That also valid for pesticides. So the EU now is working, and ProTerra is actively participating in this work and initiatives to make, for example, claims more reliable and comparable. Another active and ongoing project of the European Union is actually the PEF. That means PEF is the abbreviation for a harmonized communication and the measurement of environmental performance within a product range. It is important that the European Union develops a common methodology so we have no competition on measurement rules. And this product environmental footprint is connected also to many companies' activities and reporting when it comes to CO2 and CO2 reduction commitments. The ProTerra standard focuses on all important challenges faced by the companies in the supply chains, particularly those dependent on agricultural commodities. This enables real action to create social, environmental, and economic benefits for everyone. It is a comprehensive standard and a very powerful tool to differentiate from non-sustainable producers and to manage risk. We promote good agriculture, labor practices, the social equity, rights of communities, and biodiversity, just to mention a few of these. And all our companies face these challenges: sustainability goals, carbon footprint, climate, land use change, human rights, health and safety, social well-being issues, and the list is just long. So we have developed the standard to promote social and environmental sustainability and to support our stakeholders in their efforts to continuously improve their day-to-day practices and to help businesses in engaging and implementing the concept of sustainable development. It is, as I mentioned before, a multi-global standard that can be used as the standard also to manage multiple standards thanks to its benchmarking process. And that can also decrease administrative burden and create synergies. What does a membership offer you if you join the ProTerra network? It offers you global recognition because it is a leading sustainability standard in agricultural commodities across the supply chain. And it helps you also to demonstrate your proactive engagement and commitment regarding climate change, biodiversity, or social issues. It drives growth because you can significantly strengthen your management systems. It adds values, protects the integrity of your supply chain, and builds consumer confidence. It creates connections because it is a community of producers, industry traders, and retailers that helps to build strong commercial relationships through certification. It creates also customer confidence because a membership offers you and your customers the assurance they need to do business with you, and it helps also for you to differentiate from the other. It gives you all information and awareness because the membership gives you access to market information. We have regular newsletters and webinars going on. We inform about the last developments in the sector and online trainings that help build a more responsible business. Traceability is needed to have information on where your products are coming from. This and the TCCs, which are the traceability certificates in the ProTerra system, will be explained in detail shortly by Alice. And it is important that all companies certified under ProTerra have a stringent traceability system to guarantee security where your products are coming from and offer you also more information related to your products. So with this, now I'd like to pass the word on to her to go into the technicalities of the ProTerra standard, and later on we will move to the details of the Indian interpretation. Thank you. Alicia, the word is yours.
Thank you, Amish. And now I will start. In fact, what I made a confusion in the beginning, and I apologize for that. So again, the idea is to explain a little bit about the key aspects of ProTerra 4.1. That's the official version. So ProTerra is an independently verified sustainable standard, as Emish has explained already. It's applicable to any agricultural commodity in any part of the globe. It covers the entire supply chain from a farm to a retail. It's important to highlight that the different actors of a supply chain can be certified independently from each other. And we will discuss this a few slides ahead. So within the ProTerra scheme, the actors, or as called within the ProTerra as levels, they are divided in three groups. Level 1, agricultural production. Level 2, transport, storage, traders and dealers. And level 3, industrial processing. The next slide, please. Additionally, ProTerra can be applicable to raw materials as soy, cane, corn, as Emish showed some graphs with the current certification of these products around the world. It can also be applicable to ingredients such as lecithin, or to multi-products, products with many ingredients, such as a soy chocolate milk, for example. This can be accomplished using basically two approaches, which will impact the way the organization has its audits occurring, and also the way that the organization that's seeking certification defines and organizes its internal system. The next slide. So these two approaches will consist either in each actor being subjected to individual certification audit, and so for a product to be certified, all the ingredients, production phases, etc., have to be certified individually under this approach, or the second approach, that's a more common approach that we see in the daily ProTerra certification practice. The organization that's seeking the certification is implementing a system to control and monitor its supply chain to ensure that the relevant ProTerra standards indicators are met, because it is a ProTerra requirement that the core suppliers, and we will explain this in a bit more detail, also meet some of the ProTerra requirements. So this second approach, and it's what we want to focus now, is the management system approach. Let's say this is the generic way we're calling it. And so here in the slide, you can see the text of ProTerra standard that relates to this. Management system approach is not specifically mentioned, but it is indirectly referred to in this second paragraph we see in the screen. A management system is the way in which an organization can organize the interrelated parts of its business, creating connection, monitoring mechanisms, and control mechanism. This typically is composed by a set of policies, procedures, work instruction to ensure that the organization can fulfill the task that is required to achieve a specific objective. In this case, the objective is to have a sustainable product. Now, focusing on, again, on the management system still, because this is a very important aspect, from the certification audit perspective, it means that the core, the relevant suppliers, for example, a soybean farm is a core supplier of a crusher or a processor that's producing soy oil. From the certification audit perspective, this means that the core and relevant suppliers are visited to check the compliance with the applicable ProTerra requirements. And indirectly, therefore, one is verifying how efficient the management system that has been developed by the organization that's seeking certification has been implemented. And this is a key aspect of ProTerra standard, again, even though it has not been specifically referred to in those terms in the standard. Now, this means that the industry must engage with farmers, train farmers, have internal audits, help them develop procedures, practice, etc. So considering our example, the organization is subjected to a certification audit, while the supplier, the farms, will be subjected to a verification type audit. So this is the only way to ensure that the characteristics of the final products are met in those cases that the supply chain is not individually certified. And when I say product characteristics, I'm referring to the sustainability aspects of the product. The next slide. Well, does this mean that all the suppliers have to be visited? No. The definition of the number of suppliers that will be visited and what specific suppliers will be visited is based on requirements that have been defined in ProTerra. So sample size is defined as part of the audit, and there are specific guidelines related to these, and these are available at the ProTerra website. Core suppliers, as mentioned before, must adhere to the requirements of ProTerra, and essentially it's up to the organization seeking certification to ensure that this is duly met. The next slide. So here on the screen, we see ProTerra principles. ProTerra is organized in these principles that deploy in criteria and indicator, and ultimately during the audit, one is verifying the compliance with the indicators. And because of the broad scope, remember, it's applicable to any agricultural crop in any place of the world, and to distinct levels of operations, farm, transport, dealers, etc. So beside each indicator, one can see information about to what levels or what actors that specific requirement is applicable. And so we can see there is a broad range of topics that are covered by ProTerra, from pollution to green management to greenhouse gases and energy, traceability and chain of custody, human rights, etc. Okay, and to be certified under ProTerra 4.1, an organization has to be in compliance with at least 80% of all the indicators, and within that number, all core indicators are included. And with this, I revert back to Image.
Thank you so much. So now we move to the main topic of today's webinar, which is the Indian smallholders interpretation of the ProTerra standard. Why have we created this regional interpretation? Well, we recognize that in many parts of the world, there is a significant gap between the reality and sustainable agricultural practices in food and feed production. Therefore, regional interpretations may be necessary to help businesses engage and implement over time a sustainable approach to their activities. The concept of continuous improvement is an essential aspect of any regional interpretation. In the ideal scenario, organizations would, in the long run, reach a full alignment with the ProTerra standard. So the focus here is really on the continuous improvement and realizing that there are certain gaps, and we would like to support the companies to get there and start their sustainability journey. Before we move into the details of the interpretation, let's see briefly the role of soybean production in India. Last year, India was the 6th country globally in terms of soybean production. Last year, producing around 12.5 million metric tons, following US, Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and China, which you can see on this slide. Soybean contributes significantly to the Indian edible oil pool. Presently, soybean contributes 43% to the total oil sales and 25% to the total oil production in the country. The main areas you can see on this slide are Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, and Rajasthan. So we have to understand that it has a very important role in the Indian economy. So let me give back the word to Alici, who will explain in detail the ProTerra interpretation for smallholders. Thank you.
Well, now that we have understood a little bit more about the context of the India interpretation, as Amish mentioned, the importance to recognize the gap and to create mechanisms to ensure that these gaps can be overcome. The Indian interpretation, I would like to highlight some key aspects of the standard. First of all, it's applicable only to smallholders that in this context are defined as agricultural property owned by an individual or by a group of individuals, not and never a company, with less than 2 hectares. So we're essentially speaking about family farming. And 2, because of the gaps that Amish mentioned earlier, a reduced set of ProTerra indicators apply to smallholders. And then remember, the objective is to help the business engage and ultimately improve over time towards a fully sustainable approach. And last but not least, the industrial operations must fully comply with ProTerra 4.1. So what we're saying is that this interpretation, and I find it important to restate this, is exclusively applicable to small farms, 2 hectares. That's why the name of the standard is ProTerra Standard Smallholder Interpretation for India. The next slide. Because of the objective of implementing over time a sustainable approach to agricultural activities in India, the ProTerra standard for smallholder has adopted a stepwise approach. So a set of ProTerra requirements are to be met in the initial certification, what we're calling the entry level of ProTerra India Smallholder interpretation. A second set or additional set of requirements are necessary for the beginning of the 3rd year of the certification. And finally, all the requirements of the India interpretation are to be met by the end of the 5th year of certification. So that would give the participants a level of advance within the ProTerra India Smallholder interpretation. So we see it's a stepwise approach. From time to time, the number of requirements are increased, forcing, let's say, a continuous improvement. The next slide. So at the end of the initial certification, the participants may reach the intermediate or advanced level. So it doesn't necessarily, they don't necessarily have to go step by step. They can take a bigger step if they're more advanced. So the initial year of certification, eventually they could be classified as advanced, should that be the case. Important to say that for terms and definitions, for example, the definition of core supplier, of GMO, etc., the ProTerra standard version 4.1 should be considered. The same thing for GMO risk in crops and the forbidden pesticides. They are all referred to in the 4.1 ProTerra version. The current version of the ProTerra certification protocol available at the ProTerra Foundation website applies. And the certification protocol defines how the certification happens, what are the steps, what are the rules for the certification. And there's a specific farm sampling approach for smallholders in India. All this information is in the ProTerra website. Of course, under the India smallholder interpretation, a farm can be certified independently of the crusher or the industry if they wish to have that independent certification. The next slide. Because of the India smallholder interpretation is reduced in relation to ProTerra standard, any certification or communication related to that certification must clearly indicate the specific reference to ProTerra India smallholder interpretation and the associated level, the entry, intermediate or advanced level, as we explained. This is very important to ensure that transparent communication is happening with stakeholders. So there should be no misunderstanding when an organization is certified under this ProTerra 4.1 or when it's certified against or certified or has implemented and receives recognition for ProTerra standard for smallholders. The next slide. I see some questions popping up. We will address them in the end, okay? Oh, here's an example of how Principle 1 of ProTerra 4.1, that's the principle related to legal compliance, looks like under the Indian smallholder interpretation. We can see that the different indicators and the associated level. So for example, at the entry level, which is the initial certification, a farmer, for example, would have to demonstrate a clear title to land or the rights to use the land. While in the advanced level, beginning of the 5th year of certification, the farmer must have evolved and also be able to demonstrate continuous improvement regarding compliance with the requirements of ProTerra standard. So as I mentioned, we can see that the implementation of ProTerra smallholder interpretation in itself will drive continuous improvement over time. The next slide. So in practice, how does the certification occur? So there are basically two situations. The first one, which is a more common approach, each actor of the food or feed supply chain can be certified on its own right against the applicable ProTerra standard, which is version 4.1. And so here in the table, we can see that full compliance with ProTerra 4.1 would be expected that one has full traceability. And so when we see that, for example, for a crusher processor to be fully compliant with version 4.1, indirectly, this implies that its core suppliers are also in compliance with the requirements. Okay, so the next slide. So in the next slide here, we see the second situation that we believe will be a more common situation in India because of the current status of the deployment of sustainability topics, especially within smallholders. So it's an industry in this scenario that wants to meet ProTerra 4.1 requirements, while its core suppliers do not meet the requirements, but they are eligible to the application of the regional interpretation. So under this scenario, the industry, because of the characteristic of its suppliers, cannot demonstrate full compliance with ProTerra requirements, specifically those related to the compliance of the core suppliers with ProTerra standards and all that relates to traceability. So underlying this is the fact that the industry cannot demonstrate its product is coming from a sustainable source, because as I mentioned already, the suppliers cannot demonstrate compliance with ProTerra requirement. For example, they cannot ensure that there has not been a massive deforestation of a specific area. And ultimately then, when you cannot demonstrate traceability. Therefore, it's not possible for this processor to fully comply with ProTerra. Nevertheless, in this case, other aspects of ProTerra are met by the industry. What I'm saying is that despite the fact that the industry cannot demonstrate full traceability, it can still demonstrate a set of other compliances. For example, no child labor, collective bargaining provisions, waste and effluent management, etc. So under this situation, the suppliers are evaluated based on ProTerra India interpretation for smallholder. So if everything is okay, the industry meets the applicable and possible requirements that cover all the other topics under sustainability, and the suppliers are at least in the entry level in the first year, this means that the industry can receive a certificate of compliance with ProTerra India Smallholder interpretation, which is different than the ProTerra 4.1 certification. Okay, and at this under this scenario, also the farm can receive a certificate of participating in this process. The next slide. So the next slide, we're going to show a little bit about the sampling criteria that's used for the ProTerra India interpretation. can be applicable to producers that have multiple production areas, multiple farms, or when a processor is supplied by multiple farms, which is typically the case. Once you have small farms in India, normally industry will be supplied for a big number of farms. So this table here indicates the sampling criteria that's to be used. And in defining this, one should consider also the significant variation of size of the sites, different in location, cultural, language, and specific regulatory requirements and geographic dispersion. This is an initial sampling criteria that will be revised as soon as we have accumulated more experience with certification under this smallholder standard in India to adjust eventually the minimum number of farms that have to be visited for certification. The next slide. So what are currently the challenges for implementing ProTerra smallholder interpretation in India? Basically, these challenges relate to traceability, the way that purchases of raw material occurs based on central market, etc., has imposed some big challenges in tracing back the product to the farm. There's a great number of supplying farm, which affects the cost of certification because actually you have to visit a big number of farms. And also the need to train smallholders on sustainability topics. Okay. The next slide. And for those situations where the industry does not comply with ProTerra and sees no possibility of complying with ProTerra version 4.1, the industry can receive a declaration of participation in the ProTerra India program. But to receive this, there are a few requirements. First of all, participate in one of the ProTerra training, formally commit to supporting ProTerra vision and mission, have an internal documentation demonstrating some level of traceability, and more important, have an action plan to improve traceability over time, creating some kind of indicator that could demonstrate the increase of the percentage of the raw material where traceability exists, and creating and developing a training program to increase farmer engagement and awareness in relation to environmental health and safety and good agricultural practices. So with this, I arrived to the end of this presentation, and we would like now to open for questions, and I would revert back to Emish to coordinate the question and answer section. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Alice. Thank you so much. So I see there are a couple of questions that came in. First question relates to the size. If farmers in India having more than 2 hectares will be considered a part of the ProTerra certification or not? Well, the answer is clearly yes, but the standard 4.1, as we have it, without using the interpretation, because practically the interpretation, as Alicia explained, helps the smallholders for realities in India under 2 hectares of land to have a step-by-step approach. So in this case, that would mean that farmers that have bigger land would participate and have to apply the ProTerra certification without the smallholders interpretation, because the smallholder definition does not apply to them. The question number 2 relates to if in India maximum farmers is using the contractual manpower in the field, so it can not consider smallholder or not. We haven't defined smallholders connected to what kind of contracts they are using. The definition, as Alicia explained, is really connected to the size of the land, which we defined after a market research as 2 hectares. This may also change from country to country, but in India, we found that the definition of maximum 2 hectares would be applicable as definition of smallholders, and only those farmers that comply with this criteria can use and implement the smallholders interpretation, as has been presented in the last half an hour. And then another question relates to the size. If somebody has 20 hectares, will it be a smallholder? No. As we mentioned, the definition of smallholder is related to the size of the land that the farmer has, and that has been defined as a maximum of 2 hectares. So farmers that have bigger land, such as in this example of the question, 20 or 50 hectares, will have to implement the ProTerra standard as we know it without the interpretation. I'm just looking at the other questions, but they more or less relate to the definition, how we put it in smallholder interpretation. Then the next question relates to a traceability percentage that ProTerra is looking at in the 1st, 3rd, and 5th year of the program. I would like to pose this question on to Alice. Alice, so the question is there a traceability percentage that ProTerra is looking at in the 1st, in the 3rd, or the 5th year of the program?
No, we have not defined any specific percentage. What we expect to see is just an increase in this percentage over time and concrete actions to improve traceability, but there's no specific traceability percentage being established. And I see a question above this one related to traders can be part of ProTerra, so is there a limit on the quantity for traders? No, currently there's no limit for the quantity of traders, but traders, as the way is that the standard is organized, do not fall in the category of smallholders. So if they want to be certified, they have to implement the version 4.1. That's the applicable version to them at this point in time. Okay. And well, I don't see any other question, but I just wanted to make a comment on the question about the fact that many farmers in India, even small farmers, are using contractual manpower on the field. As that doesn't change, this is not a problem under the smallholder interpretation, but just to highlight that when using contractual manpower, the challenge is much greater from the standard, from the perspective of sustainability and all human rights, etc. So just heads up in this regard that this makes the challenge even greater if it's just the family working on the farm itself.
Another question came in regarding the definition of the smallholder. What we define as definition for a smallholder is that farmers that operate in India and have a land that is smaller or less than 2 or a maximum of 2 hectares will be defined under this interpretation as smallholders in India. I hope that clarifies.
No, and I would just complement your answer, Imish, explaining that for the smallholder in India, there's a different set of requirements than the version 4.1 of ProTerra, and that these requirements are applied on a stepwise approach. So there's a set of requirements that have to be met in the 1st year, and then there's another additional set of requirements for the next 3 years, and so on and so forth. So this allows the smallholder to improve over time. That's the main objective. Okay.
Exactly, and thank you. And another question came in. So the trader has to follow version 4.1. Can you clarify? So basically, what we are saying and are trying to explain in this webinar is that for the industrial and any level besides the agriculture, so the farm level, for the ProTerra certification, the ProTerra version 4.1 applies. The smallholder interpretation is an interpretation of the standard helping smallholders, farms under 2 hectares or with a maximum land ownership of 2 hectares, to start the certification process in using a step-by-step approach. So that means that the smallholders interpretation is only applicable for agriculture, for farm level, not for traders, not for the industry. I hope that helps, because this is really focusing on the smallholders. That's why the name is also smallholder interpretation. So it's applicable for the farm level. All other levels, such as trade, industry, retail, if they wish to have a ProTerra certification, they will apply the ProTerra version 4.1. Or would you like to add something, Alicia? I hope that made it clear.
No, I've just tried to add another piece of information that maybe was not so clearly explained during the presentation, that again, if an industry or a trader that has to consider version 4.1 wants to be certified, it is part of the rule of certification. It's part of the requirements of ProTerra that core suppliers meet some of the ProTerra requirements. And that's where the problem exists, because at the farm level, should the farm be the core supplier, there's limited sustainability practice because of the nature of the business, etc. So normally that's where the problem starts, because you're seeking certification and then you cannot demonstrate that your core supplier meets the requirements. That's why the ProTerra standard for smallholder was created, to try to minimize the gap. But in saying that, we're also saying that if your supplier does not meet ProTerra 4.1, you cannot meet ProTerra 4.1 also fully. And that's why we have created this different certification related to smallholders specifically. I don't know if I could explain this better than I did in the first try.
New question just came in, how the migrant labor will be considered if they are working on farms which are less than 2 hectares?
Well, we, under ProTerra India interpretation, there's no specific reference to migrant labor as it is, for example, as exists, for example, under ProTerra 4.1. But essential definition of ProTerra is that when we say workers, that includes everyone. The immigrant workers, the subcontractors, so everybody that's working on a farm falls in the category of worker, and everything that is applicable to a self-owned worker, let's say, oh no, but a worker that belongs to the organization, also applies to the migrant worker, the subcontractor, the temporary, the part-time, etc. It's a big box, the word worker in ProTerra. It applies to, it considers everyone. You can see that definition there.
And the next question that came in is if it is mandatory to complete 100 farmers audit, or are there a maximum of numbers of farmers a day? we do not define maximum numbers of farm audits today. That it depends also on the certification body, how they do the planning, distancing, region, etc. And what we have defined, and this is only for this interpretation, that the 100 farmers have to practically make part of the sampling approach, because in the reality in India, usually the number is much higher. So this is actually also a way we would like to support companies to start this progress and start this process and start with a limited number of farm audits that are verified. Practically the firms are verified within the scope of the industry of certification. And this number, the sampling approach, has been limited to 100. So if it would be, for example, if the number we use under the ProTerra 4.1 is usually higher, it uses a different sample approach, and we have done a few tests and calculations and showed that the number is extremely high because of the high and big number of suppliers for the industry. So that's why a number, the 100, has been defined as the number of farms that have to be audited. I don't know if that explains.
Yes, and I always want to highlight that you don't have to visit the 100 farms in one day.
Exactly.
So
it
depending on the physical location, how they are distributed, there's going to be a plan. And this visit can take some time. Or it can take a week or maybe a month. I don't know. It's going to be a big plan to be able to cover the 100 audits. But the final logistic will depend on the specific characteristics of the farm. And I wanted to go back to the question about the migrant labor and how it would be considered. I was looking in opening here on my screen, the ProTerra Smallholder interpretation. And so I just like to highlight again, migrant labor is considered a worker as any other worker under ProTerra. And in the India interpretation, smallholder India interpretation, there are basically 3 requirements that fall in the category of human rights and responsible labor practice. And they basically relate to not having slave or forced labor, not having child labor, and not using coercive, disciplinary, or controlled methods. Things such as physical, sexual, psychological, verbal abuse, or harassment. So basically, these are the 3 big groups of elements, of topics that we would be looking at when dealing with labor under smallholder interpretation. Okay.
I'm just waiting a few seconds if maybe another question comes in. And just to add to the last question, just to detail. So besides this minimum of 100 supplying farm for an industry, which, as we try to explain, how many days it requires does depend on distances and on also the certification body. So it's a part of the logistics and what you plan together with the certification body. And also, just to highlight one additional aspect when it comes to the farm sampling, that the farm selection, it has to include also, the significant variations in the size of the sites, also the geographical dispersion, and also has to consider the differences in the cultural, language, or regulatory requirements, meaning that it really has to be an average sample, this number 100, not one group, for example, close to each other, just to give an overview of the reality we are facing of the suppliers. So it has to be really the number 100 has to be a mix, and to give an average and an overview of the suppliers. Another question, Alicia, that just came in is the documentation requirement at farm level.
I don't see that question. But
what are the documentation requirements at farm level?
well, they're quite minimum. There's not really much, and what we have would be more related to traceability, actually. So there's an item related to requiring records for agricultural production, basically seed records, at the beginning of the third year of certification. So it's not something that's immediate. And this is because of traceability, in a way, okay? Record keeping would also include information about the workers. If you have external workers, their name, being able to demonstrate that they have been paid correctly. What else? Harvest records, crops, the weight of the crop, the yield, harvest dates, pests and diseases related to the agricultural aspects, the management, what has been applied to that crop in terms of pesticides, soil management information, etc. Because an audit, or be it a verification, be it a certification audit, it's based on visual evidence, things that I can see on site that have been done, and documents and things people tell me. But of course, what an auditor sees on site and the documents are very important, because they are the basis for demonstrating compliance. But again, it's a continuous improvement process, and basically it would be expected for the third year of certification. So there would be a time for the smallholder to organize, prepare, and start keeping records of the necessary documents. If you read the smallholder, there's a specific the smallholder interpretation that is available at the ProTerra website. There's a specific topic 8.3, that gives examples of the documentations that have to be kept. But again, it's something that will only be expected after the third year.
And they're asking if we expect farmers to keep all these records.
Oh yes.
Oh, yeah.
If they want to be a part of this, if they want to have their product recognized under ProTerra, they have to keep the records. There's no other way, unfortunately.
And a question related to checklists at farm level. Well, I would like to inform you that the checklists are not issued by the ProTerra Foundation. Checklists for the audits are actually issued by the certification body based on the ProTerra standard and based on the smallholder interpretation.
And again, reinforcing, even though there's no checklist, if in the ProTerra smallholder India interpretation, there's a comprehensive list of what's necessary. So that should be sufficient to help a farm organize and prepare eventually for an audit, let's say.
There is a new question. Will it be good if project level records are maintained?
We acknowledge that literacy can be a additional challenge in the whole process. In that case, then I think maybe the industry could give some support, or eventually keep these records, or help the farmers understand what has to be registered. But I think that this will not work if there's no partnership between the industry and the farm. basically saying a partnership between the industry and its suppliers. Because I think it's in the best interest of everyone that this works well.
And the comment came in that there is a requirement of information of links to be mentioned for all essential pesticides convention mentioned in the standard. I am sorry, I apologize, I don't understand the question. Probably it relates to the pesticides annex we have for the 4.1 and what applies from this annex. If I understand the question correctly, if not, I'm sorry. And it's related practically to the, we have an annex on the website, Stockholm Convention, Rotterdam, and BHO. And the question is what actually is applicable to the smallholders.
Yeah, in this case, it's the full list. As I mentioned, somewhere in this presentation, the list of banned pesticides for the ProTerra smallholders interpretation in India is the same list for anyone applying or any industry applying 4.1 version. So if you open the 4.1 version, there is an attachment and there's a link where you can see the list. And also ProTerra is working and to have a list with brand names, etc., that should be available on site shortly. That would also help identify what are the banned pesticides. And aside from what is banned under ProTerra, one has also to consider what is banned in its country of origin. So I'm sure that India also has a list of pesticides that are banned within the country. So that has to be considered also.
And if, for example, you export to Europe, you have to take also into consideration the country of destination. Our list and the banned pesticides and the links you can find on the website today refer to the Stockholm Convention, to the Rotterdam Convention, and to WHO 1A, 1B, and 2. And the next question relates to the mechanical removal of weeds on the field. So the question is, do we ask that it is practically possible on the field to use mechanical removal of weeds?
Well, actually, what we're saying is that one should minimize the use of pesticides for removal of weeds, and try to use alternative methods. That could be mechanical or whatever. I believe it's feasible. But again, just to highlight that under the smallholder Indian interpretation, this weed removal topic is not under consideration, okay? It's something only applicable to the full 4.1 version. No, there's no physical limit of chemicals. What we're saying is that one uses chemical as less as possible, but without saying what is the perfect amount. That chemical is used based on agronomical orientation, and that there's an effort to minimize the use of pesticides. For example, normally the industry has a practice of having a calendar for application of pesticides. So every, I don't know, from time to time you apply specific pesticides. When, for example, you could have a control of just in fact applying the pesticide. Once you reach certain limits of weeds or of a insect on the site, instead of having a predefined calendar of applying pesticides whenever. So the effort is not to have a number of limiting the amount of pesticides that can be applied, but rather one being able to demonstrate that they're only applying what's essentially necessary based on good practice and based on agricultural recommendation, which is a little bit different.
Another question is related to training. If there is a stakeholder or value chain actors training in India being planned. Well, this is what I think Alicia also mentioned. It will be essential to have industry collaborating with their suppliers. And I actually find it possible also that the trainings will be organized. We are here to support, and this is also why we organized this webinar today, to try to go into more detail and explain more about the content of the interpretation and answer your questions. We are also looking for partners on site to organize such trainings. So if there is bigger demand, this is definitely a possibility, yes, and definitely will be needed if these projects increase. The next question is related to calendar spraying. In India, what is the status of the calendar spraying? If there are any requirements or definitions in the smallholder interpretation related to spraying?
No, there's no specific definition. Again, the standard doesn't, in many situations, is not mandatory, doesn't present mandatory numbers. You can spray only that amount, or you can only spray in May, or it gives guidance on how to approach the topic, which is a bit different. But there's no specific calendar spraying guideline provided.
Waiting a bit to see if there are any additional questions, or if you see that you have some other doubts or questions, please feel free to address them also per email. We will be happy to answer them also after the webinar. And as I mentioned in the beginning, the link will be shared, the link to the Indian interpretation and also to the recording.
Yes, and I also like to mention that we have another webinar tomorrow. It's specifically about version 4.1. It has a different objective, but we will also discuss in more detail some of the requirements. So it could eventually be of interest of someone participating today to also join that webinar and maybe understand some of the aspects. There will be a big discussion, many aspects related, for example, to pesticides. I see that in trying to explain what is the pesticide risk and how to manage that risk while not being, while not establishing mandatory targets. It could eventually be of interest of those who have placed questions about pesticide management, even though pesticide will not be the only topic.
Super. Thank you. I see that what about, okay, last question. Then we ran out also of time. What about the standard on GMO? Is there a cooperation in India where GM cotton and soybean is cultivated by switching plots in the next season? Well, the question relates to what happens if GM cotton is used after non-GM soy, if I understand the question correctly. According to my knowledge, GM soy is still not allowed in India. But what happens, the question is what happens if GM cotton is followed by non-GM soy?
Well, under ProTerra, there's no, I've seen standards that have defined situations where you have to the land has to be free of genetically modified organisms for 2 years before you plant, but under ProTerra there's no requirement like that. So as I understand, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Amish, if you planted cotton, genetically modified cotton, and then in the next season you're planting non-genetically modified, non-GMO soybean, I don't think there's an issue.
Exactly, as long as you follow the non-GMO-related criteria indicators and the sampling of the product is GM negative, then it is not a problem. We do not have that requirement in the standard. Great. Thank you so much. I kindly ask you to address the following questions or your additional questions to us via email. I would like to thank you for your participation and your interest. We will be sharing then the links shortly after the webinar, and yeah, stay in touch and everybody stay safe. Thank you so much.
Thank you.